The storm before the wedding. The grand Sinclair estate buzzed with a whirlwind of preparations. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly baked delicacies, the fragrance of expensive flowers, and the hum of hurried footsteps echoing off marble floors. Every corner of the house had been transformed into a vision of opulence, all in preparation for the wedding of the year. Veronica Davenport, the soon-to-be bride, was a vision of sophistication. Her sleek designer dress accentuated her poised elegance, her dark eyes scrutinizing every detail in the room with the precision of a hawk. Nothing could be left to chance. Not the floral arrangements, not the lighting, and certainly not the food. Emma Carter stood behind the kitchen counter, carefully icing the last batch of pastries for the rehearsal dinner. The kitchen had been her second home since she was a child. Unlike the grandeur of the dining hall, this space was warm and familiar, filled with the hum of the oven and the comforting scent of butter and sugar. She had dedicated her life to this craft, creating flavors that had earned the Sinclair family's deep trust, until today. A sharp voice sliced through the air like a knife. "Emma, this is unacceptable." Veronica's heels clicked furiously as she stormed into the kitchen. Her voice carried, loud enough for every chef, every server, and even the butler at the far end of the hall to hear. Emma's heart skipped a beat, her hands tightening around the piping bag she was holding. She turned slowly, meeting Veronica's piercing gaze. "What's the matter, Miss Davenport?" Emma asked, keeping her voice steady. "What's the matter?" Veronica scoffed, waving a perfectly manicured hand toward the display tray. "Look at this. The soufflé has already fallen. It's flat, ruined. Are you planning to travel back in time to make it rise again?" Emma inhaled sharply. She had made dozens of soufflés that afternoon alone. But sometimes, even the most seasoned chefs had their off moments. "I'll make another batch immediately," she said, straightening her posture. Veronica's lips curled into a smirk, but her voice was laced with venom. "Fix it. Spare me the theatrics. If you had done your job right in the first place, we wouldn't be here." The room fell silent. Every chef, every server, and even the dishwashers kept their heads down, pretending not to hear. Emma felt her chest tighten as she looked around at her colleagues, people she had known for years. None of them dared to speak. No one ever did when Veronica was in this mood. Veronica turned to the room full of onlookers, her voice dripping with mockery. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Incompetence will not be tolerated. Not at my wedding." A bitter taste filled Emma's mouth, but she refused to let Veronica see how much her words stung. She had been cooking for the Sinclair family for years, perfecting her craft under pressure, and yet in this moment she was being reduced to nothing. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the kitchen made the air shift. The staff suddenly straightened, eyes darting toward the entrance. Adrian Sinclair. He stepped into the room with the quiet confidence that always made people take notice. His sharp suit was slightly undone at the collar, his dark eyes scanning the room with a calculating intensity. He didn't need to raise his voice to command authority. His presence alone did that. "That's enough," Adrian said, his voice calm but firm. Veronica spun around, her expression momentarily faltering before she quickly recovered. "Adrian, darling," she cooed, her tone softening as she reached for his arm. "I was just making sure the kitchen understood the importance of tonight's dinner." Adrian didn't move. He kept his gaze locked on Emma for a moment before turning to Veronica, by belittling the staff in front of everyone. His voice was like steel wrapped in silk. Veronica's lips tightened. "She's the cook, Adrian," she hissed under her breath. "She made a mistake." Adrian's expression darkened. "And that justifies humiliating her. Emma has worked for my family for years. She deserves respect." Veronica's cheeks flushed with indignation. "Are you seriously taking her side right now? This is our wedding, Adrian. I won't let something like this ruin it." "It's a rehearsal dinner," Adrian countered, crossing his arms. "Not a press conference." Emma could hear the quiet murmurs from the other staff members. Everyone was watching. waiting. Veronica let out a hollow laugh. You're blowing this out of proportion. I'm standing up for someone who didn't deserve to be humiliated. Adrian shot back. If you think this is me taking sides, then maybe you should rethink the way you treat people. The tension in the air was suffocating. Emma wanted to shrink into the background, to pretend she wasn't the center of this brewing storm. But there was no escaping it now. Adrian turned back to Veronica, his voice lower but no less sharp. Apologize to her. Veronica let out a scoff of disbelief. You're joking. I'm not, Adrian said, his expression unreadable. Silence. The weight of Adrian's command hung between them. Veronica looked around, realizing that every staff member, every guest in earshot, was watching. She had built her reputation on control, on always being the one with the upper hand. And now, here she was, being told to apologize to the very person she had just torn down. Emma saw it in her eyes, the flicker of rage, of humiliation. Veronica wasn't just angry, she was livid. But in the end, she had no choice. With great reluctance, she turned toward Emma, her voice like glass grinding against stone. I'm sorry. Emma knew the apology was hollow, but she nodded anyway. There was nothing else she could do. Adrian exhaled, his gaze lingering on Emma for a brief moment before he turned back to Veronica. We need to talk. In private. Veronica's smile reappeared, but it was brittle. Of course, darling. As they left the kitchen, the whispers behind them grew louder. Emma exhaled slowly, her hands still trembling as she reached for the tray of ruined soufflés. She didn't need to look up to know the questions running through everyone's minds. What was going on between Adrian and Veronica? And more importantly, what role did she play in it? The breaking point. The parlor doors slammed shut with a force that made the crystal chandelier above tremble. Veronica stood at the center of the lavishly decorated room, her breathing heavy, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. The soft golden glow from the wall sconces did little to soften the sharp angles of her fury. Adrian followed behind her, closing the distance between them with slow, measured steps. Unlike her, his demeanor was composed, too composed, and that only made her angrier. She spun around, her eyes blazing. Are you out of your mind? She hissed, her voice dangerously low. You humiliated me in front of everyone, Adrian, in front of our guests. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? Adrian ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling slowly. You embarrassed yourself, Veronica, he said, his voice eerily calm. You didn't just correct Emma. You tore her apart in front of an entire room. That wasn't about the soufflé. That was about control. Veronica let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Control? That's rich coming from you. You're the one who just undermined me in front of everyone, choosing to defend. She stopped herself, swallowing the words, her jaw tightening. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Go on. Say it. She lifted her chin, her breath coming quicker. Choosing to defend her, she spat, her voice filled with venom. The kitchen girl. The servant. Adrian's jaw tensed. Her name is Emma, he said firmly. And she has worked for my family for longer than you've even known me. You don't get to treat her like she's beneath you. She is beneath us, Adrian. Veronica snapped, her voice rising with raw indignation. She's a cook. She doesn't belong in our world. You, of all people, should understand that. Adrian let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. Is that what this wedding is about to you? Keeping up appearances, securing your place in some high society fantasy. Veronica's expression hardened. Don't pretend you don't care about those things. Your family's name, your reputation. You were born into this, Adrian. It's who you are. No, Adrian said, his voice quieter, but no less firm. It's who I was told to be. A flicker of uncertainty passed through Veronica's face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by defiance. You're being ridiculous, she said, shaking her head. This isn't about Emma. It's about us, about everything we've built together. Adrian took a step back, his expression unreadable. Built? He repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. Veronica, we don't have anything. We don't talk anymore. We don't laugh anymore. All we do is plan this perfect life that you've decided is the only one that matters. Because it does matter. Veronica shouted, her composure slipping. You think love is enough. You think choosing some simpler life is going to magically solve everything. Wake up, Adrian. You walk away from this, from me, and you walk away from all of it. The life you were meant for. The future you deserve. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet it sent a chill down Veronica's spine, he asked, And what if I don't want that future anymore? Silence. For the first time, real fear flickered in Veronica's eyes. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. She had always been able to predict Adrian, to mold him into what she needed. But now she saw something unfamiliar in his expression. He meant it. She took a slow breath, pushing down the tremble in her hands. Adrian, she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. You don't mean that. You're just. I do. The word hung between them like a final blow. A lump formed in Veronica's throat. She wasn't used to losing. But she refused to lose now. She inhaled sharply, composing herself, then stepped closer. If you walk away from me, Adrian, she whispered, there's no coming back. Adrian's expression didn't waver. Maybe I don't want to come back. The color drained from Veronica's face, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she let out a breathless laugh, as if this were all just an inconvenience to her. Fine, she said, her voice cool once more. But don't expect me to go quietly. She turned on her heel, her dress flowing behind her like a storm, and marched toward the door. Just before she disappeared, she looked over her shoulder, her eyes cold and calculating. You're going to regret this. Then she was gone. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Emma tried to focus on her work, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. The entire staff had witnessed what happened in the kitchen earlier. Even now, as she kneaded dough, she could feel their glances, curious, wary, whispering amongst themselves. Emma. She looked up to see her father, Robert, standing at the counter. His face was etched with concern. Are you all right? Emma exhaled, shaking her head. I'm fine. Robert frowned. Emma. The way he said her name, so familiar, so steady, made her throat tighten. She looked down at her hands, gripping the edge of the countertop. She humiliated me, she admitted quietly. And Adrian, she hesitated. He defended me. Robert studied her carefully. He always did have a way of seeing what mattered. Emma scoffed lightly, but there was no humor in it. It doesn't change anything. Doesn't it? Robert asked. Emma didn't reply. Before Robert could say more, the kitchen door swung open. Adrian stepped inside, his presence instantly commanding attention. The room fell silent. His gaze immediately sought out Emma. Can we talk? He asked, his voice softer than before. Emma hesitated, glancing at her father. Robert gave her a small nod. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and followed Adrian out of the kitchen, her pulse quickening. As they stepped into the dimly lit hallway, she finally looked up at him. His expression was troubled, but not uncertain. I wanted to make sure you were all right, Adrian said. Emma swallowed hard. I'm fine. Adrian hesitated. What happened back there? That wasn't just about a ruined souffle. Emma folded her arms. I know. I should have stepped in sooner, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. I should have. You don't need to apologize, Adrian. He met her gaze. Maybe I do. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emma said, You and Veronica. What happens now? Adrian exhaled. That depends. On what? He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. On whether I finally start making choices that are my own. The weight of his words settled deep in Emma's chest. She didn't know what this meant for either of them. But she had a feeling that whatever came next, it was only the beginning. A line crossed. The storm that had brewed within the Sinclair estate was no longer just whispers in the corridors or quiet tensions behind closed doors. It had erupted into something bigger, something dangerous. By the next morning, everyone knew. The engagement between Adrian Sinclair and Veronica Davenport was officially over. Yet, even as the mansion staff exchanged hushed murmurs over the latest scandal, Emma Carter refused to acknowledge the shift. She had spent her entire life blending into the background, unseen yet indispensable. This wasn't her battle. She would not be dragged into it. But that choice was never hers to make. The moment she stepped into the hallway outside the kitchen, she knew something was wrong. The air was thick with anticipation, a quietness that made the estate feel colder. Then she saw them, two of Veronica's closest friends, Jessica and Claire, perched near the grand staircase, their polished nails clutching expensive teacups. The moment their eyes landed on Emma, their whispers stopped. Emma ignored them, keeping her head high as she walked past. But Jessica's voice, deliberately loud, sliced through the silence. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," she mused, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. Claire smirked. "Oh, absolutely. Adrian always did have a soft spot for charity cases." Emma stopped mid-step. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to turn around. She had learned a long time ago that people like them fed off reactions. But Jessica wasn't done. "Poor Veronica," she sighed dramatically. "Imagine losing your fiancé to the help. How humiliating." Emma's hands curled into fists. She forced herself to walk away. Elsewhere in the estate, Adrian leaned against the heavy oak desk in his study, staring at the paperwork scattered before him. A glass of scotch sat untouched beside him, the amber liquid glowing under the dim lighting. He had barely slept. The meeting with his lawyers had been worse than expected. Veronica wasn't going down quietly. She was suing him. Her legal team had filed claims of defamation, breach of promise, and even emotional distress. And to make matters worse, she had named Emma in the lawsuit. Adrian clenched his jaw. He should have seen this coming. There was a knock at the door. He looked up, already knowing who it was. Robert, the Sinclair family's longtime butler, entered with his usual composed demeanor. "Sir, if I may." Adrian sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You don't have to say it, Robert. I already know this is a disaster." Robert folded his hands behind his back. "Miss Davenport has never been one to accept defeat graciously." "That's putting it lightly," Adrian exhaled, glancing at the lawsuit papers. "She wants to drag everyone down with her." Robert hesitated, then said carefully, "Including Emma." Adrian's expression darkened. "I know. She doesn't deserve this," Robert said, his voice quieter now. Adrian's grip on the desk tightened. "No, she doesn't." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Robert spoke again. "Then what do you plan to do about it, sir?" Adrian's gaze lifted. And for the first time in days, there was no hesitation in his eyes. A confrontation long overdue. Emma was in the middle of rolling out dough when the kitchen doors swung open so hard they nearly came off their hinges. She barely had time to react before she heard Veronica's voice, sharp as a blade. "Leave us," Veronica ordered the kitchen staff. No one argued. Within seconds, the kitchen was empty. Emma set down her rolling pin and turned to face the woman she had spent years avoiding. Veronica stood tall, her designer coat draped over her shoulders like a royal cloak, her expression a carefully controlled mask of fury. But her eyes, burned with unfiltered rage. Emma didn't flinch. "What do you want?" Veronica let out a cold laugh, slow and deliberate. "Oh, Emma," she sighed, tilting her head. "You still think you get to ask questions." Emma met her gaze without wavering. "If you came here to throw more insults, I'm busy." Veronica's lips twitched into a smirk. "Busy ruining lives." Emma exhaled through her nose, willing herself to stay calm. I didn't ruin anything. If Adrian called off the wedding, that's between you and him. Veronica stepped closer, her heels clicking against the tile. That's where you're wrong. This isn't just about Adrian and me anymore. It's about you. Emma didn't move. I have nothing to do with this. Veronica scoffed. Spare me the innocent act. You've always been there, haven't you? Always lingering in the background, always waiting for your moment. Well, congratulations. She spread her arms mockingly. You finally got what you wanted. Emma clenched her jaw. I didn't ask for this. But you didn't stop it either. Veronica shot back. Emma's patience snapped. And what exactly was I supposed to do, Veronica? Beg Adrian to marry you. Pretend he doesn't have a mind of his own. Veronica's eyes flashed. You will regret this. Is that a threat? Emma asked, her voice steady. Veronica leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. It's a promise. Then, with a satisfied smirk, she turned and strode out of the kitchen, her coat billowing behind her like a shadow. Emma exhaled, gripping the edge of the counter as her hands shook. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The turning point. That evening, as the sun cast golden light across the estate, Emma found herself pacing outside the garden. She knew Adrian would come looking for her, and sure enough, the sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. She came to see you, didn't she? Adrian asked. Emma crossed her arms. Yes. His jaw tightened. What did she say? Emma hesitated, then sighed. That I ruined everything. That I'll regret this. Adrian muttered a curse under his breath. She's trying to intimidate you. Emma met his gaze. It won't work. Adrian studied her for a moment before nodding. Good. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustling of the wind. Then Adrian took a slow breath. Emma, I can't let this continue. She frowned. What do you mean? I mean, I need to end it, for good, Adrian said, his voice firm. No more lawsuits, no more threats, no more games. If Veronica wants a war, I'll give her one. Emma inhaled sharply. Adrian. She's trying to ruin your life, he interrupted. I won't let that happen. Emma looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time she realized Adrian wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for her. For them. And suddenly, she wasn't afraid anymore. She stepped closer. Then let's end this. Adrian's lips parted slightly, as if he wasn't expecting her to say that. But then, after a moment, he nodded. Together, they turned toward the estate, where the final battle with Veronica awaited them. Neither of them looked back. Because there was no going back now. The final battle. The air inside the Sinclair estate had turned thick with tension, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone inside. Staff whispered in the corners, wary of the storm brewing between the Sinclairs and the Davenports. The wedding was officially off, but that didn't mean Veronica was done fighting. If anything, she was more determined than ever to make Adrian regret his decision. And Emma, she was the prime target. Emma had spent the morning working in the kitchen, ignoring the murmurs that surrounded her. But the truth was, she felt it too, that gnawing unease, the knowledge that something was coming. She could feel it in the way people avoided her gaze, the way her father, Robert, had been unusually quiet all morning. And then, right before noon, it happened. The kitchen doors swung open, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. Their presence alone made the air still. Miss Carter, one of them asked, his voice clipped and professional. Emma straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. Yes. You need to come with us. Emma's heart pounded. Why? The taller of the two men stepped forward, producing a document from the folder he was holding. You've been served. Emma felt like the ground had been yanked out from under her. She barely registered her father stepping forward, his face dark with anger. What is this about? Robert demanded. The man handed Emma the paper, ignoring Robert. "Miss Carter, you are being named in a defamation and interference lawsuit by Miss Veronica Davenport. You will be required to testify in court regarding your actions leading to the dissolution of her engagement." Emma's breath caught in her throat. This was worse than she had expected. Veronica wasn't just trying to scare her, she was trying to destroy her. Robert took the papers from Emma's shaking hands and scanned them quickly, his eyes narrowing. "This is absurd," he muttered. "Veronica doesn't have a case." The men remained expressionless. "That will be for the court to decide." Emma took a slow breath, her fingers curling around the edge of the counter. She had known Veronica would retaliate, but she hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly. She needed to talk to Adrian. Adrian's response. Emma stormed through the estate, her steps quick and determined. She found Adrian in his study, his sleeves rolled up and his expression dark as he flipped through a stack of papers. The tension in his shoulders was evident, but the moment he saw her face, he immediately stood. "What happened?" he asked. Emma threw the papers down on his desk. "Veronica happened." Adrian's jaw clenched as he picked up the lawsuit notice. His eyes moved over the words, his expression darkening with every second. When he was done, he exhaled sharply and set the papers aside. "She's dragging you into this," he said, his voice dangerously low. Emma crossed her arms, feeling the first wave of real anger take over. "She's not just dragging me into this. She's trying to ruin me. My father. Our livelihoods." Adrian's hand curled into a fist. "This isn't just a warning shot. She's going for blood." Emma let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, she made that clear. But I won't let her win, Adrian." Adrian stepped forward, placing his hands on her arms gently, grounding her. "You won't have to do this alone." Emma looked up at him, something heavy settling in her chest. "You don't have to fight my battles." Adrian met her gaze, his voice unwavering. "Emma, this isn't just your battle. This is ours. And I won't let her destroy you because of me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emma searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation. But there was none. Adrian wasn't backing down. Finally, she nodded. "Then we fight." Adrian gave her a small, determined smile. "We fight." A trap set in motion. By evening, Adrian's lawyers were already in motion, preparing their counterarguments. Emma had been advised to avoid contact with Veronica, which she was more than happy to do. But as she walked through the dimly lit corridor later that night, she realized that avoiding Veronica wasn't an option. Because Veronica was waiting for her. The moment Emma turned a corner, Veronica stepped out of the shadows, arms crossed, her red dress clinging to her like battle armor. "Well," Veronica drawled, her voice silky but sharp, "it didn't take long for you to come running to Adrian, did it?" Emma met her gaze evenly. "Did you expect me to just roll over and let you destroy my life?" Veronica smirked. "Oh, Emma, you don't understand, do you? This isn't about destroying your life. It's about making an example of you." Emma clenched her fists. "I did nothing wrong." Veronica took a slow step forward. "That doesn't matter. What matters is what I can prove." Her eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "And the story I tell." Emma stiffened. "You're lying." Veronica leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "That's the thing about power, sweetheart. People believe what I tell them to believe." Emma didn't back down. "Adrian won't let you win." Veronica's smirk faltered for just a second before she quickly recovered. "Adrian can't save you from this." Emma lifted her chin. "Then we'll see about that." For the first time, something unreadable flickered across Veronica's face. Annoyance. Uncertainty. Either way, she took a step back and turned on her heel. "This is just the beginning," she called over her shoulder. Emma stood there, breathing heavily, her heart hammering in her chest. No, this was the beginning of the end, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The press conference. The next morning, Adrian called for an emergency press conference. Emma stood behind him in the grand foyer of the estate as he addressed the sea of reporters. The moment cameras started flashing, the reality of the situation hit her. This wasn't just between her and Veronica anymore. This was public. Adrian's voice was steady, strong. "I will not be intimidated into silence," he declared. "This lawsuit is nothing more than a desperate attempt to rewrite history. The truth is simple. I called off the engagement because it was the right thing to do. And I will not allow innocent people to be dragged through the mud to satisfy someone's need for revenge." The reporters were relentless with their questions. "Adrian, are you saying Veronica is lying? Do you have proof that Emma wasn't involved in your breakup? Are you in love with her?" That last question sent a ripple of silence through the crowd. Emma's breath caught. Adrian didn't hesitate. He turned slightly, glancing at her for just a second before answering. "What I feel for Emma is none of your concern. But what I will say is this: she is not to blame for the end of my engagement. I made that decision alone." The press conference ended shortly after that, and Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. As the last reporter left, Adrian turned to her. "Are you okay?" Emma exhaled. "I think so." Adrian searched her face, then slowly, carefully, took her hand. "We'll get through this." Emma squeezed his hand in return. For the first time, she believed him. But she also knew the final battle with Veronica was still to come. And she would be ready. The gloves come off. After the press conference, the Sinclair estate was eerily quiet. The reporters had finally left. The murmurs of the staff had died down, but the weight of what had just happened still hung in the air. Emma had never been in the public eye before, and now, overnight, she had become a name in a high society scandal. Adrian remained by her side as they stepped away from the front hall, his grip on her hand firm but gentle. He didn't say anything until they reached his study, where the heavy oak doors shut out the outside world. "You did good," Adrian said, pouring them both a drink. "I know that wasn't easy." Emma let out a humorless laugh as she took the glass from him. "I just stood there while reporters debated whether I was some gold-digging homewrecker." Adrian's jaw tensed. "That's exactly what Veronica wants. She doesn't need the truth. She just needs enough people to believe her version of it." Emma sighed, setting the glass down. "What happens now?" Adrian leaned against the desk, his expression unreadable. "Now, we fight back." Emma frowned. "How?" "She has lawyers, connections, the media practically eating out of her hand. What do we have?" Adrian met her gaze. "We have the truth, and a few weapons of our own." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Like what?" Adrian pushed off the desk and crossed the room to a locked cabinet. He pulled out a set of documents and laid them out on the desk. Emma stepped forward, scanning the papers. Her eyes widened. "These are financial records," Adrian confirmed. "Ones Veronica would rather no one see." Emma's brows furrowed as she picked up a page, scanning the numbers. "She's been hiding money." Adrian nodded. "More like funneling it into places she shouldn't. Offshore accounts, questionable donations, even a few under-the-table deals her family made years ago." Emma looked up at him. "You think this will stop her?" Adrian's lips curved into something almost dangerous. "No, but it'll give her something else to worry about." Veronica's breaking point. Hours later, the call came. Emma was in the library, trying to find a moment of peace when she heard Adrian's phone vibrate. She watched as he answered, his expression unreadable. Then his mouth twitched into a knowing smirk. "She got the message," he murmured. Emma sat up. "Veronica." Adrian nodded, lowering the phone. "She wants to meet. Now." Emma felt her stomach tighten. "Is that a good idea?" Adrian met her gaze. "It's necessary." The final confrontation. They met in one of the estate's private lounges, where the golden chandeliers cast a soft glow over the tension thickening in the air. Veronica stood by the window, her arms crossed, her expression as sharp as a blade. But for the first time, There was something else in her eyes. Unease. Emma and Adrian entered, standing across from her. Neither spoke first. Then Veronica broke the silence. "You really thought that little press conference would change anything?" She sneered, her voice cool but laced with frustration. Adrian's smile didn't waver. "It's not the press conference you should be worried about." Veronica's jaw tightened. "What did you do?" Adrian stepped forward, placing the stack of documents on the coffee table. Veronica's gaze flickered to the papers. She hesitated, but only for a second before striding forward and snatching them up. As her eyes scanned the records, the blood drained from her face. Emma watched as Veronica's hands clenched the papers. Adrian's voice was quiet but firm. "You have two choices, Veronica. Drop the lawsuit and walk away, or we take these to the authorities. And trust me, once these go public, you won't be dragging me through the mud. You'll be sinking in it." Veronica's eyes snapped up. "You think you can blackmail me?" Adrian shrugged. "Call it leverage." For the first time since this all started, Veronica looked truly cornered. She gritted her teeth. "You wouldn't." Adrian simply crossed his arms. "Try me." Emma saw the cracks forming in Veronica's carefully constructed armor. The anger, the desperation, the realization that she had lost control. Then Veronica's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for Emma to recognize the panic beneath the fury. Veronica's voice dropped to a whisper. "You don't understand. If this gets out, it's not just me who falls. My family." Adrian didn't flinch. "Then maybe you should have thought of that before trying to burn my life down." Silence. Then Veronica exhaled sharply, throwing the papers down on the table. "Fine," she spat. "You win." Emma barely had time to register the words before Veronica turned on her heel and stalked toward the door. But just before she disappeared, she stopped. Glancing over her shoulder, she locked eyes with Emma. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and venomous. Then she was gone. Aftermath. The next day, the lawsuit was officially dropped. The media lost interest within a week, moving on to the next scandal. But even though the battle was over, Emma knew the war wasn't forgotten. She sat on the back patio of the estate, watching the sun dip below the horizon, when Adrian joined her. "She's not coming back, Emma," he murmured. Emma turned to look at him. "You don't believe that?" Adrian sighed. "No, but I do believe she's lost her power over us." Emma hesitated. "So what now?" Adrian leaned back, his expression softening. "Now we start over." Emma looked out at the fading sunlight, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready for that. The reckoning. The storm had passed, or so it seemed. The Sinclair estate was quiet, too quiet. The media frenzy had faded, the lawsuit was dropped, and Veronica had retreated into the shadows. But Emma knew better than to believe it was over. Veronica wasn't the type to surrender. And when a woman like her disappeared, it wasn't to lick her wounds. It was to plot her next move, the unexpected visit. It had been a week since the confrontation. Emma had spent most of her time in the kitchen, trying to return to normal. But normal didn't exist anymore. She could still feel the lingering stares, the weight of unspoken words from the staff who had seen her name splashed across headlines. She thought she could push through it, but then something happened that made her realize the war wasn't over. A black luxury car pulled up to the Sinclair estate. The staff whispered, peering through the windows as the driver stepped out and opened the door. And out stepped William Davenport, Veronica's father. The man was a legend in high society, ruthless, powerful, and known for handling family business quietly. He didn't make public spectacles like his daughter. No, when William Davenport wanted something, he handled it behind closed doors. Emma watched from the hallway as the butler hesitated before announcing the guest. Adrian stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Show him in." Emma knew she should leave, but something told her this was about her too. So she stayed. The negotiation. William Davenport didn't waste time with pleasantries. The moment he stepped into Adrian's study, he got straight to the point. "You embarrassed my daughter." Adrian leaned back in his chair, unaffected. "She embarrassed herself." William exhaled slowly. "She was angry, Adrian. Hurt. And when Veronica is hurt, she reacts poorly." Adrian let out a humorless laugh. "That's an understatement." William's gaze darkened. "That lawsuit could have been much worse. I convinced her to drop it, but don't think for a second that this is over." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Are you here to make threats, William? Because I've had enough of those." The older man smirked. "No threats, just a deal." Adrian's brows furrowed. "What kind of deal?" William leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I want this whole mess buried. I don't want Veronica's name tied to this scandal any longer. You have your freedom. Fine. But you will never speak of her again. No interviews, no offhanded comments. Nothing." Adrian crossed his arms. "And in return." William glanced toward the door, his gaze sharp. "Emma Carter leaves." Emma's heart stopped. Adrian's expression turned cold. "Excuse me. You want to live your life. Fine," William continued smoothly. "But you cannot live it with her. It's already bad enough that the press is painting her as the woman who stole you from my daughter. If she stays in your life, this scandal will never die." Adrian let out a slow breath. "You want me to cut her out of my life?" William shrugged. "It's the price for peace." Emma's chest tightened, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to walk away, pretend she hadn't heard any of it. But she had heard it, and it changed everything. She was the price. Again. Adrian stood, his voice ice cold. "You think I would trade her for your silence?" William met his gaze evenly. "I think you've lived in this world long enough to know that everything has a price, and some things aren't worth losing everything over." Silence. Emma knew this was Adrian's moment, the moment he had to decide. Not just about her, about who he was. And then he spoke. Adrian's answer. Adrian's voice was steady. "You want to know the difference between you and me, William." William arched a brow. "Enlighten me." "I don't trade people like chess pieces." William's expression remained unreadable. "That's a noble sentiment, Adrian. But nobility doesn't get you far in our world." Adrian stepped forward. "Then maybe I don't belong in this world anymore." For the first time, William's face betrayed something. Surprise. Amusement. A flicker of respect. Whatever it was, it disappeared quickly. William sighed. "So that's your answer." Adrian didn't hesitate. "It is." William studied him for a long moment before shaking his head with a small chuckle. "You are your mother's son." Emma saw Adrian's jaw clench at the mention of his late mother. Without another word, William turned and headed toward the door. He paused briefly when he saw Emma standing there. His gaze was assessing, calculating. Then he smirked. "You're either the luckiest woman in the world, or the most dangerous." Emma didn't blink. "Guess we'll find out." William chuckled and left without another word. The moment he was gone, Emma finally let out the breath she had been holding. Adrian turned to her. "You heard all that?" She nodded. "I heard." Adrian's shoulders relaxed slightly. "You okay?" Emma exhaled. "I should be asking you that." Adrian gave her a small smile. "I just gave up my last chance to make peace with the Davenports. There's no going back now." Emma met his gaze. "And are you okay with that?" Adrian reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers. For the first time. "Yeah." Emma squeezed his hand, her heart pounding. "Then so am I." And in that moment, she knew this was real. No more secrets, no more games. They had won. Together. The fallout. In the days that followed, the Davenports made their retreat from public scrutiny. Veronica was noticeably absent from social events, and rumors swirled that she had been sent away for image rehabilitation. As for Adrian and Emma, they moved forward. Adrian resigned from the Sinclair family business, choosing instead to invest in something that actually made him happy, building something of his own. And Emma, for the first time in her life, she didn't just feel like someone standing in the background of the Sinclair estate. She felt free. The war was over, and this time, she was finally choosing her own future, a new beginning. The Sinclair estate no longer felt like home. The grand halls, once filled with the sounds of high society banter and the quiet, dutiful movements of the staff, now echoed with emptiness. The war was over. Adrian had won his freedom. Emma had survived the storm. And now, it was time to leave. Packing up the past. Emma stood in the massive kitchen, her fingers tracing the edges of the countertops she had spent years working behind. This space, more than any other in the house, had been her refuge. Now, it was nothing more than a memory. Robert entered, his weathered hands resting on the back of a chair as he watched her. "It's strange, isn't it?" he murmured. Emma looked up, offering a small smile. "Strange is an understatement." Her father chuckled. "You always said you'd leave this place one day." Emma exhaled, leaning against the counter. "I never thought I'd actually do it." Robert studied her carefully. "Are you sure about this?" Emma turned, glancing out the window at the sprawling estate grounds. The answer came easily. Yes. Adrian had made his decision the moment he refused William Davenport's deal. He was leaving behind the Sinclair fortune, the business, the name. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one that felt right. And Emma was going with him. A different kind of future. 2 months later, the Sinclair estate had been sold. The new owners, a couple from out of state, had plans to convert it into a boutique hotel. Adrian didn't stick around to watch it happen. He and Emma had moved into a small but charming house in a quieter part of town, away from the gossip and the expectations of the elite. The kitchen was smaller, but Emma loved it more than any grand estate she had ever worked in. And the best part, they were opening their own bakery. Adrian had bought an old storefront, a building that had been abandoned for years. And together, they were turning it into something new. Something theirs. Opening day. The smell of fresh bread and pastries drifted onto the sidewalk as the bakery doors officially opened. It wasn't a grand affair. There were no press cameras, no reporters looking for the latest scandal. Just locals, excited to see something new in the neighborhood. Emma stood behind the counter, her hands dusted with flour, her heart pounding. Adrian stood beside her, rolling up his sleeves. "Are you ready?" Emma laughed. "I have no idea." Adrian smirked. "Good. That makes 2 of us." The first customer stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Emma took a deep breath, looked at Adrian, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking back. She was looking forward. To a new life. A new beginning. And this time, it was her choice. Epilogue. 1 year later, the bakery had become a staple of the community. Mornings were filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, the hum of conversation, and the sound of Emma laughing as she rolled out dough. Adrian, once the heir to a fortune, now spent his days kneading bread and making coffee, and he had never been happier. One evening, after closing, he leaned against the counter, watching Emma as she put the final touches on a cake order. "You know," he mused, "we did it." Emma looked up, arching a brow. "Did what?" Adrian grinned. "We built something real." Emma wiped her hands on a towel and stepped closer. "Yeah, we did." He pulled her into a slow, easy embrace, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Emma smiled against his chest. "None." And for the first time, she truly meant it.